The briefing room went silent when the wreckage photos hit the screen. Four-star General Marcus Havelock stood motionless, his weathered face illuminated by the projector's pale glow. Behind him, satellite imagery showed something that shouldn't exist, an aircraft so damaged it resembled a sculpture of violence more than a machine. The tail section was shredded into aluminum ribbons. The right engine housing had been obliterated, leaving only a charred skeleton. Hundreds of holes perforated the fuselage in patterns that suggested not just enemy fire, but a sustained execution. Yet according to the data stream still transmitting from its black box, this aircraft had flown for 73 minutes after taking the damage. It had crossed 240 nautical miles of hostile airspace, and it had landed. "This is impossible," Havelock said quietly. The officers around the table shifted uncomfortably. They'd all seen combat. They'd all lost people to far less catastrophic failures. The general's aide, a young captain with precisely parted hair, cleared his throat. "Sir, the pilot is currently in medical, stable condition, requesting to debrief." Requesting, Havelock's eyes narrowed. That pilot should be in a trauma ward sedated. "She walked off the flight line, sir." The pronoun hung in the air. Several faces around the table registered surprise, though they tried to hide it. Havelock's expression didn't change, but something flickered behind his eyes, a calculation adjusting. "Name?" "Captain Joanna Viper Reyes, sir. A-10C pilot, 47th Fighter Squadron." Havelock had heard that call sign before, though he couldn't immediately place where. The Air Force had fewer than 100 A-10 pilots still flying, and even fewer women among them. The Warthog wasn't a glamorous assignment. It was low, slow, and terrifyingly close to the fight, a beast from a different era of warfare that somehow refused to die. Like its pilots, it was all function, no flash. "Get her up here," Havelock ordered, "and get me the gun camera footage. I want to see what she flew through." As the room emptied, Havelock remained standing before the image of the destroyed aircraft. He'd signed condolence letters for pilots who'd ejected from less damaged birds. He'd attended funerals for crews lost to single missile strikes. This thing, whatever had happened out there, defied every survivability metric the Air Force had established over 70 years of jet combat. The door opened behind him. Havelock turned. The woman who entered wasn't what the recruiting posters looked like. She was compact and wind-burned, with dark eyes that had the thousand-yard stillness of someone who'd recently made peace with death. Her flight suit was clean, borrowed. The original had apparently been too blood-soaked to wear. She moved with a slight limp but stopped at attention with parade ground precision. "Captain Reyes reporting as ordered, sir." Havelock studied her for a long moment. "Sit down, Captain, and tell me how the hell you're still alive." Reyes didn't sit. She remained at attention, eyes fixed on a point somewhere beyond the general's shoulder. "Permission to speak freely, sir." "Granted." "I didn't fly that aircraft back, sir. It flew me back. I was just along for the ride." The answer irritated Havelock. It sounded like false modesty or, worse, shock-induced confusion. "Captain, you manually piloted a catastrophically damaged aircraft through contested airspace for over an hour. That's not the plane. That's you." For the first time, Reyes's eyes focused directly on him. There was something unsettling in that gaze, not defiance but a kind of exhausted certainty. "Respectfully, sir, you weren't in the cockpit. I was. And I'm telling you that bird wanted to come home." Havelock gestured toward the chair again. This time, Reyes sat. The general moved to the opposite side of the table, deliberately positioning himself not as an interrogator but as someone seeking to understand. He'd flown fighters himself once, decades ago, before the stars and the politics. He remembered what it felt like when the machine became an extension of your will, when the boundary between pilot and aircraft blurred into something almost mystical. "Start from the beginning," he said quietly, "the whole mission." Reyes inhaled slowly, as if gathering herself. "It was a standard close air support tasking, sir. Firebase Delta 7 had been taking indirect fire for 3 days. Intelligence suggested enemy armor was massing for a coordinated assault. We were first light, two A-10s providing overwatch until the Apache could rearm and return. Who was your wingman? Captain Marcus Dagger Chin, sir. Good pilot, solid. Havelock noted the present tense. Chin had made it back then. Continue. We checked in with the JTAC at 0540 local. Call sign was Anvil 26. Young guy sounded scared. You could hear the impacts in the background when he talked. He gave us the target coordinates, approximately 4 kilometers northeast of the firebase, along a ridgeline that provided direct observation of their position. Reyes paused, her fingers drumming once against her thigh, a unconscious rhythm that might have been related to weapons release or engine throttle. Havelock recognized it. All pilots had their tics, their muscle memories that persisted even on solid ground. We came in from the west at 12,000 feet, running the targeting pod to identify vehicles. Dagger spotted them first, 8 BTR-80s and what looked like 3 T-72 variants, all dug into revetments. Good camouflage discipline. They'd been there a while. Prepared position, Havelock observed. Yes, sir, which should have told us something. Reyes' jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. We rolled in standard. Dagger took the northern group, I took the southern. I came off target after the first gun run and saw secondaries. 2 BTRs confirmed destroyed. That's when everything went sideways. The general leaned forward slightly. This was where the story would become interesting. The gap between routine mission and catastrophic damage was often measured in seconds, in the space between one heartbeat and the next. They were waiting for us, sir. Not the armor. That was bait. The real ambush was layered AAA and at least 2 SA-13 launchers positioned in the dead ground behind the ridge. We'd been herded into a kill box. Havelock's expression hardened. The SA-13 was an older system, Soviet-era, but still lethal against low-altitude aircraft. And the A-10, for all its legendary toughness, was designed to absorb small arms fire and light cannon rounds, not radar-guided surface-to-air missiles. Dagger called out the launch. I broke left, popped flares, went full defensive. The first missile tracked the flares standard. The second one didn't. Joanna Reyes had grown up in West Texas, where the sky was a physical presence and the land stretched so flat you could see weather systems forming 100 miles away. Her father had been a crop duster, flying ancient thrush commanders held together by paint and prayer, and she'd spent her childhood summers in the right seat, learning to read the wind. When she told him she wanted to fly fighters, he'd laughed, not mockingly but with the kind of disbelief reserved for the genuinely impossible. Women flew fighters now, sure, but not girls from nowhere towns with populations smaller than a high school. Not girls whose families fixed their own planes because mechanics were a luxury. She'd proved him wrong, of course. Top of her class at the academy, distinguished graduate from pilot training, immediate assignment to fighters. But they'd given her the A-10, and she'd known immediately it was a judgment. The Warthog wasn't a fighter, not really. It was a flying gun platform, a truck with wings, the unglamorous workhorse of close air support. The pilots who flew F-22s and F-35s didn't talk to A-10 drivers at the club. They looked through you, as if operating at supersonic speeds created some fundamental perceptual gap. Reyes hadn't cared. The first time she'd fired the GAU-8 Avenger cannon, felt that brutal 30mm recoil shake the entire airframe, she'd understood. This wasn't about elegance or speed. This was about bringing people home. The grunts on the ground didn't care about stealth characteristics or radar cross-sections. They cared about a plane that would come low and slow and close, that would orbit overhead for hours, that would put rounds precisely where they were needed. The A-10 did that better than anything ever built. Her call sign, Viper, had come during her first deployment. They'd expected her to wash out or at least to show fear, to hesitate when the tracers came up close enough to see. Instead, she'd flown lower than anyone else in the squadron, threading between hills at altitudes that made ground fire not just possible but likely. When her squadron commander had asked why she took such risks, she'd replied, "If I'm not close enough to get shot at, I'm not close enough to help." Someone had muttered that she was crazy as a viper in a hen house, and the name had stuck. She wore it like armor. The second missile struck her aircraft's right engine at precisely 05:47:23 local time. The warhead was a 9-kilogram directional fragmentation type, designed to shred turbine blades and set fuel alight. It performed exactly as engineered. The engine exploded in a cascade of white-hot metal, and Reyes felt the plane yaw violently right as if struck by a giant's fist. Every alarm in the cockpit activated simultaneously, a Banshee symphony of warnings that would have paralyzed a less experienced pilot. Her hands moved without conscious thought, a product of 10,000 hours and countless simulator emergencies. Left rudder to counteract the yaw. Throttle on the good engine to idle to reduce stress on the airframe. Assess the damage. The right engine was gone, obviously, but the left was still producing power. Hydraulic pressure was fluctuating, yellow indicators on two systems, but the primary was holding. Flight controls responsive but sluggish. "Viper's hit," she transmitted, her voice preternaturally calm. "Right engine gone, staying in the fight." "Negative, Viper, egress immediately." That was Dagger, his transmission clipped with barely controlled panic. "You're trailing fire." Reyes glanced at her mirrors and felt her stomach drop. A plume of black smoke streaked behind her like a funeral banner, and she could see flames licking along the engine housing. But below her, Firebase Delta 7 was still taking fire. The JTAC's voice crackled through, desperate. "Viper, Anvil 26, we have troops in the open. Repeat, troops in the open. They're getting massacred down here." The right answer was obvious. Egress. Live to fight another day. The plane was damaged but flyable, and she could make it back to base, probably. Staying in the fight with a burning engine was suicidal. It was the kind of decision that looked heroic in retrospect but insane in the moment. Reyes rolled in for another pass. The remaining armor had broken from their positions, sensing weakness, and were advancing on the firebase. She could see muzzle flashes from the BTRs, see dirt geysers erupting around running figures. She armed the gun and felt the aircraft shudder as the GAU-8 spooled up. The trigger was smooth under her finger. She pressed it, and the world became thunder. 2 seconds of sustained fire, approximately 120 rounds of 30mm depleted uranium, stitched across the lead T-72. The tank's turret erupted in a secondary explosion, so violent she felt the concussion through her damaged aircraft. She walked the fire onto the next vehicle, the next, her vision narrowed to the targeting reticle and the ground rushing up to meet her. Pull-up came too late, always too late in the A-10. The plane wallowed through the air with all the grace of a dump truck, trading speed for armor and firepower. She hauled back on the stick and felt something in the airframe snap, a physical, audible crack that transmitted through her seat. The aircraft yawed again, harder this time, and wouldn't respond to her inputs. "Viper's hit again," Dagger's voice. "Jesus Christ, Viper, punch out." The ejection seat was right there. The handles were designed to be instinctive, impossible to miss even with tunnel vision and shock setting in. She could pull them and be under canopy in 15 seconds, safe, alive. The A-10 would augur in spectacularly, but planes were replaceable. Pilots, supposedly, were not. Her left hand went to the ejection handle, wrapped around it. She could feel the texture of the grip, the slight give of the mechanism. One pull and this would be over. Below her, through the smoke and the flames reflecting off her canopy, she could see Firebase Delta 7. Could see the small figures of American soldiers running, fighting, dying. Could see the remaining vehicles turning to flee now that their armor support was broken. Reyes released the ejection handle. She fought the aircraft back to something resembling controlled flight and keyed her radio. "Anvil 26, Viper, targets suppressed. You're clear to maneuver." The JTAC's response was delayed as if he couldn't believe what he was hearing. Viper, Anvil 26, copy. You saved our lives. Are you okay? She wasn't. The aircraft was bleeding hydraulic fluid, fuel, and what she suspected was oil from the remaining engine. The fire in the right nacelle was spreading despite the automatic suppression systems. The flight controls required both hands and constant correction, and her airspeed was decaying despite full power on the left engine. I'm heading home, Anvil 26. Keep your heads down. Dagger had formed up on her left wing, and she could see him through the canopy, helmet turning to assess the damage. His voice was tight when he transmitted. Viper, you need to eject. That bird is coming apart. Not yet, she replied. I can make it. Make it where? We're 200 miles from base over hostile territory. You're on fire and barely flying. This is insane. He was right, of course. Every survival instinct, every line of training, every regulation said to eject now while she still could. But Reyes had spent her entire career being told what she couldn't do, where she didn't belong, what was too dangerous for someone like her. She'd smiled and nodded and then done it anyway, proving them wrong one flight at a time. The A-10 groaned beneath her, metal fatiguing and failing, but it was still flying, still fighting. She thought of her father's crop duster, held together by determination and physics. She thought of all the times she'd been underestimated, all the doubters. She thought of the soldiers at Firebase Delta 7 who would go home because of what she'd done. I'm not leaving this plane, she told Dagger. Not until I have to. The next 73 minutes would determine whether that decision was bravery or delusion. The immediate problem was altitude. Reyes was at 4,000 feet, which was survivable if she ejected, but problematic for a damaged aircraft trying to cross mountain ranges. The good news was that her flight path home didn't require her to climb. The valleys ran roughly southeast, the direction she needed to go. The bad news was that flying low meant ground fire remained a threat, and her maneuverability was increasingly compromised. She ran through the emergency procedures from memory, but most of them ended with eject immediately or land as soon as practical. Neither option seemed viable. Ejecting over hostile territory meant capture or death. Landing anywhere short of base meant abandoning the aircraft to enemy forces, which would gleefully parade the wreckage for propaganda purposes. Plus, something stubborn in her refused to give the plane up. It had taken the hit meant for her. It was still flying. That deserved something. The hydraulic situation was deteriorating. She'd lost the right system entirely, and the left was reading 30% and dropping. The backup system was holding, but it only powered essential flight controls. If she lost that, the plane would become uncontrollable. She adjusted her grip, feeling the stick growing heavier, requiring more force to produce less response. Dagger, I need you to relay to base. Tell them Viper is inbound with major damage. I'll need the whole runway, crash crews standing by. Already done, Dagger replied. But Viper, seriously, your fire is getting worse. I can see flames through your engine access panels. She didn't need him to tell her. She could smell it, the acrid stench of burning hydraulic fluid and searing metal penetrating even the cockpit's environmental seals. The right side of her aircraft was cooking itself, and it was only a matter of time before something critical failed. The question was whether that time was enough. The radio crackled with a new voice, deeper and more authoritative. Viper, this is Hammer 11. That was her squadron commander, Lieutenant Colonel David Hammer Rodriguez. I need you to assess whether that aircraft is controllable. It's controllable, sir, Reyes replied. Barely. That's not good enough, Captain. I'm ordering you to eject. We'll recover you via SAR. Search and rescue in hostile territory. That could take hours, assuming they could locate her, assuming enemy forces didn't find her first. She'd heard the stories of pilots who'd spent days evading capture, and the ones who hadn't evaded successfully at all. Sir, I can make it back. That's not your call, Viper. I'm watching the telemetry from your aircraft. You're losing structural integrity. Your fire suppression has failed. You have maybe 15 minutes before that bird tears itself apart. Eject. Now." The words hung between them, a direct order from a superior officer. Disobeying it would mean court-martial, end-of-career disgrace. But Reyes had discovered something in the last few minutes, something clarifying. She'd already made her peace with dying. The missile should have killed her. Every second since then was borrowed time. That realization brought a strange freedom. "Sir, with respect, I'm staying with the aircraft until I can't." A long pause. She could imagine Hammer in the operations center, surrounded by staff officers, all of them staring at her telemetry readouts, at the impossible data coming from a plane that should have already crashed. Finally, his voice returned, softer now. "Then bring it home, Viper. We'll be waiting." The mountains rose ahead, jagged peaks that scraped the clouds. Her planned route took her through a pass at 6,000 feet, but she wasn't sure the aircraft would climb that high. She advanced the throttle on the good engine and felt the plane shudder, straining. The vertical speed indicator showed a feeble 200 feet per minute, barely ascending. Dagger had moved into trail formation, giving her space. His silence was worse than his protests. He was watching her die in slow motion and couldn't do anything about it. The fire had spread to the wing root. She could see it now without using the mirrors, could see flames actually licking at the fuselage just outside her peripheral vision. The heat was noticeable in the cockpit despite the environmental systems working overtime. She wondered distantly if the ejection seat would even function properly if the fire reached the mechanisms. At 5,000 feet, the left engine coughed. The turbine temperature spiked into the red and the power output dropped precipitously. Reyes felt her stomach fall. If she lost the good engine, this was over. No power meant no control, meant an unrecoverable spin into the mountains below. She pulled the throttle back slightly, trying to baby the engine, to coax a few more minutes of life from machinery that was well beyond its design limits. The turbine temperature retreated marginally. The power held. She started breathing again. "Vipers at 5,000, she transmitted, approaching the pass. The gap between the peaks was perhaps 2 miles wide and shrouded in morning haze. She could see birds wheeling in the thermals, eagles, probably, riding the updrafts. They scattered as her burning aircraft approached, as if sensing the wrongness of it. Metal and fire didn't belong in the sky, not like this. The pass walls rose on either side, close enough that she could make out individual rocks and scraggly vegetation clinging to impossible slopes. The air was rougher here, turbulence bouncing her aircraft up and down. Each bump sent fresh jolts of pain through the damaged structure. She heard new sounds, creaking, groaning, the tortured protest of metal being asked to perform beyond its limits. Then she was through. The mountains fell away behind her, and ahead stretched the Piedmont, rolling hills giving way to flatter ground. Base was still 160 miles distant, but it was all downhill from here. Gravity, for once, was her ally. The fire had reached the hydraulic reservoir. She watched the gauge as the remaining pressure bled away, watched as the numbers dropped from 30% to 20 to 10. At 5%, the flight controls went completely manual, no assistance, just raw cables and her muscle against aerodynamic forces designed for hydraulic augmentation. It was like trying to steer a bus with the power steering failed. She locked her arms and used her entire body to move the stick, to keep the wings level, to maintain something resembling a controlled descent. Sweat poured down her face, stinging her eyes. Her muscles screamed. She ignored all of it. Viper say fuel state. She'd almost forgotten about fuel. She checked the gauge and felt a black laugh bubble up. 1,400 pounds. Enough for maybe 20 more minutes at current consumption, except the consumption was increasing as the damaged engine worked harder to maintain power. At this rate, she'd flame out before reaching base anyway. 1,500 pounds, she lied. I'll make it. Nobody corrected her. Maybe they knew she was lying. Maybe they didn't care anymore. The whole thing had taken on the quality of inevitability, a tragedy unfolding in real time that everyone could see but no one could stop. At 50 miles out, she began her descent. The base sat at 2,000 feet elevation, which meant she could start trading altitude for distance, gliding when possible to conserve fuel. The aircraft responded like a stone, dropping fast and hard. She caught it at 3,000 feet and held it there, balancing thrust and drag in an equation that had too many variables and no good solution. The left engine coughed again. This time, the power didn't recover. The turbine temperature surged past red line into zones labeled with warnings about catastrophic failure. Rays waited for the explosion, for the sudden loss of thrust that would end this. The engine held. Somehow, impossibly, it continued producing power. She could hear it through the airframe, a grinding, shrieking noise that suggested imminent self-destruction, but for now, still turning, still burning, still fighting. Viper has the field in sight. Ahead, through the smoke and the haze, she could see the runway. It looked impossibly small from this distance, a strip of concrete in the desert, but it was home. She'd landed there hundreds of times, usually after routine training sorties, bored and ready for lunch. This time, she was arriving from hell. Viper Tower, runway is yours, crash crews standing by, medical is on station. She almost laughed. Medical. As if the problem was her, not the aircraft that was currently experiencing multiple catastrophic failures simultaneously. But she keyed the mic professionally. Viper, Roger, beginning approach. The landing gear was the next problem. It was hydraulically operated and she had no hydraulics. There was an emergency backup system, nitrogen bottles that would blow the gear down, but it was a one-shot deal. If it didn't work, she was landing gear up on a bed of sparks and grinding metal. At 10 miles, she pulled the emergency gear extension handle. Nothing happened. She pulled it again harder, still nothing. Tower Viper, gear won't extend. I'm going to have to bring it in dirty. A belly landing in a burning aircraft. The scenarios had all been covered in training, but training assumed you'd eject before it got this bad. Training assumed you valued your life more than the machine. Viper copy. Recommend you eject. We can't guarantee containment if you belly land with active fire. She could see the runway clearly now. Could see the emergency vehicles lined up along its length, the foam trucks and ambulances. Could see people standing, watching, waiting to see if she made it or if they'd be pulling her body from the wreckage. The decision point. Eject now, land safely under canopy, watch the A-10 cartwheel and explode without her. Or stay with it, try to land, probably die in a fireball that would be spectacular and pointless. From a purely logical standpoint, there was no choice. Joanna Reyes didn't eject. She couldn't explain it, not even to herself. Partly it was stubbornness, the Texas refusal to quit even when quitting was sensible. Partly it was loyalty to a machine that had protected her, had taken damage meant to kill her, had flown when it had every reason to fall. Partly it was spite, a desire to prove that she could do this, that they couldn't break her. But mostly, in a way she couldn't articulate, it was love. She loved this ugly, brutal, unglamorous plane. She loved what it represented, what it did, the people it saved. Abandoning it felt like abandonment of self. Tower Viper, I'm landing. The runway rushed up. She was too fast and too high, all the equations wrong, but it was too late to go around. The damaged engine was making a noise like a dying animal. The fire had spread to the left wing. She could see metal actually glowing red through the smoke. She pulled the throttle to idle. The plane fell like a brick. Ground effect caught her at the last second, cushioning the descent fractionally. The belly struck concrete with a sound like a bomb, a tremendous, world-ending crash that rattled her teeth and slammed her spine into the seat. Then the world was sparks and shrieking metal. The aircraft slid down the runway on its belly, shedding parts, spinning slowly. The canopy disintegrated around her, and suddenly she was in the open air, wind and smoke and chaos. The plane was still moving, still sliding, leaving a trail of destruction and fire. It finally stopped at the runway's far end, just short of the overrun. The silence that followed was surreal. No engine noise, no alarms, just the crackle of flames and the distant sound of sirens approaching. Reyes hung in her harness, stunned. She was alive. Impossibly, inexplicably, she was alive. Her hands moved automatically, going through the shutdown procedures even though there was nothing left to shut down. Muscle memory was a hell of a thing. The crash crews arrived in seconds, drowning the aircraft in foam. Someone was yelling at her to evacuate, to get out before the fire reached the fuel tanks. She fumbled with the harness release, her hands shaking now that the adrenaline was fatting. The mechanism was jammed. She pulled harder, panic finally setting in. She'd survived the mission, survived the landing, and was going to burn to death in the wreckage because of a stuck release. Hands grabbed her multiple sets, pulling her bodily from the cockpit. She felt herself lifted, carried, deposited on the concrete 50 yards from the burning hulk. Someone was checking her for injuries, asking questions she couldn't process. She pushed them away and stood on shaking legs. The A-10 was dying. The foam had contained the worst of the fire, but the damage was catastrophic. The entire right side was simply gone, shredded and burned and blasted away. The left wing was crumpled. The fuselage was perforated like Swiss cheese, and yet somehow it had flown. It had brought her home. "Captain Reyes, you need to sit down. You're in shock." Maybe she was, but she needed to see. She walked closer to the wreckage, ignoring the protests of the medical personnel. She needed to understand how this thing had stayed airborne. It defied physics, defied engineering, defied common sense. Someone had retrieved her helmet from the cockpit. She took it numbly, feeling the weight of it, the scratches and scorch marks on its surface. Her call sign was painted on the side in fatting letters, Viper. She'd earned that name by being willing to get close, to take risks, to go where others wouldn't. This morning, she'd taken that philosophy to its absolute limit. "Captain Reyes." She turned. General Havelock was walking across the tarmac, his expression unreadable. The medical team parted for him instinctively. He stopped a few feet away, studying her with those calculating eyes. "Sir," she said reflexively, trying to come to attention and failing as her legs wobbled. "At ease, Captain. Hell, sit down before you fall down." He gestured, and someone produced a chair. She sat gratefully. Havelock remained standing, looking between her and the wreckage. "I watched the whole thing on the live feed. That was the most simultaneously impressive and insane piece of flying I've ever witnessed." "Thank you, sir, I think." "It wasn't a compliment. You disobeyed a direct order to eject. You risked a multi-million-dollar aircraft. You endangered the crash crews. He stopped, his jaw working. "You saved 37 American soldiers at Firebase Delta 7. The JTAC's after-action report says they'd have been overrun without your support. You're going to get a medal for this. You're also probably going to get court-martialed." The words hung between them. Reyes found she didn't care much either way. She was alive, the soldiers were alive, and the A-10 had died the way it had lived, fighting to the last second. "Sir, I understand, but I'd do it again." Havelock's expression softened fractionally. "I know you would, Captain. That's what worries me." He glanced at the wreckage again. "How the hell did that thing stay in the air?" "I don't know, sir. It just did." The general nodded slowly, as if that answer made sense on some level beyond engineering. He turned to leave, then paused. "Get checked out by medical, then get some rest. We'll need a full debrief in 48 hours once you're cogent. And Captain, don't talk to the media. This thing is going to be a circus once word gets out." He was right about that. Within hours, the story had leaked. A female A-10 pilot had flown a catastrophically damaged aircraft back from hostile territory, refusing to eject, landing gear up in a blaze of glory. The details were garbled and sensationalized, but the core was true enough. By the next day, her name was everywhere. By the week's end, she was being called a hero, an icon, a symbol of everything right with the Air Force. Reyes hated all of it. She wasn't a symbol. She was a pilot who'd made a series of decisions that had, through luck and stubbornness, worked out. The real hero was the plane, and the plane was being unceremoniously scrapped, cut apart for metallurgical analysis and damage assessment. She visited the wreckage one last time before they hauled it away. The maintenance crews were cataloging the damage, over 600 individual holes and impacts, 3 major structural failures, complete loss of one engine and partial failure of the other, total hydraulic system collapse. The chief master sergeant overseeing the operation was a grizzled veteran named Torres who'd been working on A-10 since before Reyes was born. "Never seen anything like it, ma'am," Torres said, shaking his head. "This bird should have come apart in midair, the stress loads alone, and look here." He pointed to a section of the wing spar. This was cracked clean through. The wing was held on by maybe 30% of its normal attachments. You were flying on prayers. Reyes traced her fingers along the damaged metal. It was still stained with soot and hydraulic fluid, still warm to the touch from the cutting torches. "Will any of it be salvageable?" "The gun, probably. That GAU-8 is built like a tank. Some of the avionics if we're lucky, but the airframe," he shook his head. "Total loss. She gave everything she had, ma'am. She's earned her rest." The words struck harder than expected. Reyes felt her eyes sting and turned away before Torres could see. It was stupid to mourn a machine, irrational to feel grief over metal and circuitry. But the A-10 had been more than that. It had been a partner, a protector, a testament to the idea that some things, ugly, unfashionable, underestimated things, could still be worth more than all the pretty alternatives. The memorial service for the aircraft was unofficial and poorly attended. A few squadron mates showed up, uncomfortable in their service dress uniforms, unsure what to say. Dagger was there, silent and somber. Colonel Rodriguez gave a short speech about sacrifice and duty, but his heart wasn't in it. You didn't usually eulogize equipment. Reyes didn't speak. She stood at attention while they presented her with a piece of the aircraft, a section of the hull with her call sign still visible, mounted on a plaque. The metal was twisted and scarred, a relic of violence and survival. She accepted it wordlessly and carried it like a coffin. The days that followed were a blur of debriefings and medical evaluations and media inquiries that were always politely declined. The Air Force couldn't decide how to handle her. She disobeyed orders but saved lives. She destroyed an aircraft but became a PR goldmine. The solution, predictably, was to promote the positive and quietly bury the negative. The court-martial never materialized. Instead, she was given a medal in a ceremony that felt more like a performance than recognition. General Havelock presented the award, a Distinguished Flying Cross with Valor device. The citation praised her extraordinary heroism and selfless dedication to mission completion in the face of overwhelming adversity. It mentioned the soldiers saved, the enemy destroyed, the incredible feat of airmanship. It didn't mention the disobeyed orders or the millions of dollars in destroyed equipment. When Havelock pinned the medal to her uniform, he leaned in close and murmured, "You earned this, Captain, but don't ever pull a stunt like that again." "No, sir,"